The Book of Tides. Chapter 1. The Edge of the Storm. The wind rose off the water before noon. It carried the taste of iron and the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The harbor flags were stretched thin, snapping like arguments that had gone on too long. Tom set the shutters against the windows and listened to the nails creak. The boards were old. Everything in the house was old. He could hear the radio from the next cottage, weather reports repeating in a steady, reasonable voice that didn't fit the sound of the wind. He made coffee, black and strong, and stood at the sink watching the sea roll in. The phone lay on the counter. He kept expecting it to ring, though he didn't know who would call. Maybe no one did anymore. It rang at 1:30. Tom. He knew the voice before the name came. Lena. I'm in Rockport, she said. They've closed the bridge south. Thought I'd wait it out. You still up the hill? He looked at the gray sheet of water slanting across the harbor. Still here. Mine company? There was a pause before he said, No. Good, she said, and hung up. By the time she arrived, the storm had begun to tear at the trees. Her car door swung wide in the wind. He caught it before it slammed. She laughed once, breathless, hair plastered to her face. Same wind, she said. It's worse. You always said that. She stepped inside, dripping, her coat dark with rain. The smell of wet wool filled the small room. Still making coffee? She asked. Never stopped. Then pour me one. He did. She cupped it in both hands, warming them over the steam. For a while, they said nothing. The windows shuttered. Rain ran down in bright threads. You look different, she said finally. So do you. Older. Real. She smiled, not quite. That's new. They sat on the couch, the storm pressing around them like an extra wall. The electricity flickered. Remember the last time it blew like this? She asked. 08. Boat went down off Pemaquid. We watched from here. You left the next week. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. You remember the date. I remember everything. That can't be easy. It isn't. The lights steadied again. She set her cup down carefully. I wasn't going to come, she said. I figured. The bridge closed, the road flooded. It felt like a sign. Of what? She shrugged. Whatever keeps us in circles. He nodded. The rain hit the roof harder. At dusk the power went out. He found 2 candles and set them between them on the table. The flame bent in the draft, but held. Romantic, she said. Practical. That too. The candlelight made her face look younger for a moment, or maybe just softer. He wondered what her life looked like now. The details, the small things he had never been part of. You married? He asked. No. You? No. Still alone then. Not always by choice. She laughed, quiet. None of us are. They listened to the storm. It had a rhythm now, long gusts followed by silence, like breathing. Later they opened a bottle of wine. It had dust on it. The cork broke, and she pushed it in with a spoon handle. You still drink this cheap stuff? She said. Better in weather like this. They drank in short sips. She walked to the window and looked out. The sea's up to the pier, she said. It'll cover it before midnight. You should leave. And go where? Somewhere dry. He shook his head. I've ridden worse. She turned, hair caught by the draft from the chimney. You always think you can outlast things. He didn't answer. The house gave a slow groan in the wind. She came back to the table and leaned on her elbows. The candle was burning low. Shadows flickered on the ceiling. I used to dream about this room, she said. You left because of it. Maybe because of you in it. He poured the last of the wine. And now? I don't know. Maybe I wanted to see if it still mattered. Does it? She looked at him for a long time. Yes, she said finally. That's the trouble. He felt something move in his chest, something he'd kept sealed away too long. Outside, thunder rolled over the bay, low and steady. The candle went out with a hiss. The room fell to gray. They could hear only the rain and the distant crash of waves. She said, Do you still write? When it's quiet. What about? About storms. That figures. He smiled in the dark. You always said I loved weather more than people. Maybe that's why we didn't work. Maybe that's why we did. She reached for his hand. He let her. They sat like that, still, while the wind tore at the eaves. Near midnight, the storm eased. A faint light spread through the clouds, the moon behind them. The air smelled of salt and broken branches. She stood. I should go before the roads flood. You won't make it far. I'll stop in town. He followed her to the door. The night was wet and shining. The road gleamed like oil. She turned to him. If I'd stayed then. It would have ended the same. You think so? I know it. She nodded once. You never lie. He said nothing. The rain had turned to mist. She stepped into the car, started the engine, and rolled down the window. Good night, Tom. Good night, Lena. She drove away slow, the taillights fading into fog. He stood there until the sound was gone. When he went back inside, the candle was cold wax, bent sideways. The air was heavy and still. He sat down, listening to the sea pulling back over the rocks, and thought how storms never really leave, they just wait offshore. Chapter 2. The morning after the storm. When Tom woke, the house was pale with light. The wind had gone. The quiet was strange, too soft after the hours of hammering rain. He sat on the edge of the bed and listened. The sea still moved beyond the hill, rolling slow and even now, like an animal tired from the fight. He pulled on his boots and went outside. The air was cold and sharp. The yard was littered with branches. One of the shutters had come loose and hung crooked. The road down to the harbor was covered in leaves, black and slick as oil. The smell of wet pine rose in the air. He could still see where her car had turned at the end of the drive. Tire tracks filled with rainwater, leading away toward town. Inside, the coffee pot sat empty. 2 cups on the table. He picked hers up and saw the mark of her lip, a faint curve in the dust of the rim. He washed it, then stopped halfway through, left it in the sink. He didn't know if she had made it past the flooded road. Maybe she'd stopped at one of the motels near the turnoff. Maybe she'd kept going, the wipers beating against the glass, the sea at her side, gray and endless. He spent the morning clearing branches from the path. The muscles in his shoulders burned, but it felt good to move. Around noon, he walked down to the dock. The harbor was a mess. Boats swung on their moorings, ropes tangled, bits of net and driftwood piled against the rocks. A gull sat on a post, feathers ruffled, watching him. Charlie Brenner was already there, hammering at the side of his skiff. Thought you'd be gone by now, Charlie said. Nowhere to go, Tom said. Storm hit bad up the point. Heard the power's still out. Tom nodded. Came through worse. Maybe. You hear about the bridge? What about it? Washed out near the center span. Won't be open for a week. Tom looked at the horizon. The sky was bright but uneasy, clouds stacked low like gray walls. You looking for someone? Charlie asked. Tom shook his head. Just checking the lines. Charlie squinted. Heard a car on the hill last night. Thought maybe. Yeah, Tom said. She came by. That's so. Didn't stay. Charlie grunted. Always does that, don't they? Tom didn't answer. He finished tightening the rope and stood there a while, watching the water hit the pier in slow, measured slaps. Back at the house, the power flickered on again. The radio came alive with static and calm voices describing damage, rainfall totals, and rescue updates. He turned it off. He lit a fire in the stove and made soup from what he had left. The air filled with the smell of onions and smoke. He sat by the window and ate, watching gulls drift over the harbor mouth. On the table lay a single piece of paper, torn from a notebook. He hadn't seen it before. It must have slipped under the bottle the night before. He picked it up. It said, "If you ever stop writing about storms, you'll have to write about me instead." There was no signature. None needed. He folded it, set it in the drawer beside the matches. In the afternoon, he walked down toward town. Fallen branches covered the road, and puddles reflected the high, cloudless sky. A truck passed, loaded with sandbags and a group of men in bright vests. They waved. He nodded back. The town was quiet. The diner was open, lights on, but no music. He stepped inside. The bell above the door rang once. "Morning, Tom," said the waitress, Ellie. "Coffee, please." She poured him a cup and leaned on the counter. "Heard from anyone?" "No. Roads are bad west of here. Couple cars stranded near the bridge." He looked up. "Anyone from out of town?" "Some woman driving a silver sedan," they said. Didn't catch a name. He felt his stomach pull tight. "She all right?" "Fine, far as I know. Waited it out at the motel. Left early." He nodded slowly. "Thanks." Ellie studied him. "You look like you didn't sleep." "Didn't much." "You writing again?" He smiled faintly. "Trying." "Good. The town could use another story." He drank his coffee. The warmth spread through him but didn't reach far. When he left the diner, the air had turned clear and bright. The sea glittered through the gaps in the buildings. He walked to the edge of the pier, the boards still wet under his boots. The same gull circled once above him, crying out sharp and lonely. He He thought about her handwriting, small, slanted, impatient. He hadn't seen it in years, but it hadn't changed. The note felt like something unfinished, like a door left open. He took the path back home along the bluffs. From up there, the horizon looked endless again. The storm had taken what it wanted and left the rest behind. That night, he lit another candle. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the stove. He sat at the table with his notebook open. The first page was blank. He stared at it for a long time before writing. He wrote about the storm first, about the sound of the roof and the wind, and the way the sea looked under lightning. He wrote about silence, how it changed a room after someone had left. Then he wrote about her, just her name, once. He stopped there. Sometimes that was enough. He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. The fire was dying down, shadows moving along the walls. Outside, the tide was coming in again, whispering against the rocks. He thought of what Charlie had said, that they always come back. Maybe that was true. Or maybe what came back was the sound of them, the echo that didn't fade. He listened until he couldn't tell where the sea ended and his thoughts began. In the middle of the night, the phone rang again. He stared at it, heart steady but fast. The sound cut through the quiet like a thin blade. He let it ring 3 times before answering. "Tom," she said. "Lena, did you get my note?" "I did." A pause. He could hear traffic behind her, maybe the hum of a highway. "I shouldn't have left like that." "You always do." "I know." He waited. The line hissed softly. "I'm in Portland," she said. "Heading south tomorrow." "All right. I could stop by, if you want." He looked at the window, at the faint light of the moon over the water. "You'll have to come before the next storm." She gave a quiet laugh. "Then I'd better hurry." The line clicked. The hum disappeared. He stood there, holding the phone long after it went silent. The tide had turned again by dawn. He could hear it in the rhythm against the rocks, calm but restless. He made coffee and sat by the window, watching the horizon pale to gold. The world always started clean after a storm, he thought. But it never stayed that way. Chapter 3. The Return. The week passed gray and slow. The weather turned mild again, but Tom didn't trust it. The sea looked calm, though the waves still broke hard against the rocks below the bluff. The air had that thin smell of salt and pine that always came after heavy rain. He spent the mornings working on the roof and the afternoons writing. The notebook stayed on the table, half filled now. Sometimes he thought of her voice on the phone, how she had said I'd better hurry, and wondered if she meant it. On Thursday, he woke early and drove into town for supplies. The streets were quiet. The diner was open, same as always. Ellie poured his coffee and said the power had gone out again up the coast. "You see her?" she asked. "Who?" "Your storm lady." He smiled a little. "Not yet. She'll be back," Ellie said. "They always come back when they say they won't." "Maybe." He paid and left. The gulls were circling low over the harbor, white against the gray sky. The water had that heavy look again, dark and full of movement underneath. When he got back, her car was there. The silver sedan, parked half off the drive, front tires sunk a little in the wet gravel. The driver's door open. Her coat hung over the porch rail, dripping from a light drizzle. He stood there a long time before he went inside. She was in the kitchen, barefoot, hair tied up, sleeves rolled past her elbows. There was a pan on the stove and the smell of butter in the air. She looked up, smiled as if it were nothing. "You were out," she said. "I was." "You didn't lock the door." "I don't." She turned back to the stove. Some habits never change. He set the bags down on the counter. "Neither do some people." She laughed softly. "I'll take that as a compliment." He didn't answer. The sound of the sea came faint through the walls. She made breakfast, eggs, toast, coffee. They ate in silence for a while, the kind that felt both comfortable and sharp at once. "I thought you were heading south," he said finally. "I did." "What changed?" "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He looked at her hands. They were steady now. The last time she'd come here, she hadn't been. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked. "Not yet." "You?" He shook his head. "Wasn't looking. That's the difference between us." He smiled small. "Maybe." She leaned back, studying him. "You don't talk much anymore." "I never did." "That's not true," she said. "You talked in the mornings. Before coffee. About tides and boats and the way light falls on water. It mattered to you." "It still does." "Then say it." He looked out the window. "The tide's turning." She gave a small nod. "That'll do." After breakfast, they walked down to the shore. The path was damp and narrow. Ferns brushed their jeans, leaving dark marks. The air had that clean, hollow sound that comes after rain, when even the wind is tired. The beach was empty. A few gulls stalked the sand where the tide had pulled back. The sea was the color of lead. Lena walked ahead, her shoes in her hand. The hem of her jeans darkened in the water. "You still think about leaving?" she asked without turning. "Sometimes." "Where to?" He shrugged. "South. Maybe west." "You won't. You belong to this coast." He smiled. "You sound like you're accusing me." "I am." He bent, picked up a piece of driftwood, threw it far into the surf. It vanished before it landed. "Do you ever stop running?" he asked. She looked at him then, hair pulled by the wind. "No." They stood there a long time. The waves hissed, quiet and constant. By afternoon, the clouds broke open. Light fell in broad, clear stripes over the water. They walked back up the hill together. She carried her shoes. He carried nothing. Inside, she made more coffee. The smell filled the small kitchen. She moved as if she'd never left, opening drawers, finding cups where she remembered them. "I miss this place," she said. "You miss the idea of it." "Same thing." He looked at her. "No, the idea's always cleaner." She stopped, looked at him across the counter. "You're colder now. Or you're warmer." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Maybe both. The afternoon passed quietly. He worked outside, stacking the fallen branches from the storm into a pile near the shed. She read on the porch, legs tucked under her, a blanket over her knees. Every so often, he looked up and saw her there, still, watching him. When he came back in, she said, "You ever think about selling this place?" "Sometimes. And it's all I've got. It's just a house." He shook his head. "No, it's what's left." She closed the book. Left of what? He didn't answer. Evening came slow. They sat by the fire. The air smelled of wood smoke and salt. She opened a bottle of wine again, set 2 glasses down. "To old storms," she said. "To what's still standing," he said. They drank. The firelight moved on her face, soft and uncertain. The quiet stretched between them, the kind that waits to be broken. "You ever think about why we do this?" she said. "What?" "Come back. Tear it open again. Because we don't know how to stop." She looked at him. "You think it's habit." "It's memory. That's worse." He nodded. "I know." Later, she stood by the window. The moon was out, pale and high over the water. Her reflection moved on the glass, ghost-like. "You never remarried," she said. "No." "Why not?" He thought a moment. No one fit the silence. She turned. "And me?" "You broke it." She laughed once. "You make it sound poetic." "It wasn't," he said. "Just true." She came closer. The air between them shifted. He could smell the wine and salt on her skin. "Tell me," she said. "If I stay, what happens?" He looked at her, steady. "Then we start over." "And if I go?" He took a breath. "Then I wait for the next storm." She smiled. "You always did love the weather more than me." He didn't answer. Her hand brushed his sleeve. He could feel her pulse through the fabric, quick and fragile. "Don't make me a metaphor," she said. "I won't," he said. She stood there another moment, then kissed him once. Light, almost nothing, and stepped back. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. "That's all you ever do." She left the next morning before dawn. The house was quiet again, the air cold. On the table lay her book, open to the middle, a line underlined in pencil. "Some storms never pass. They just change their name." He read it twice. Outside, the first light touched the water. The sea was calm, for now. He made coffee, poured 2 cups out of habit, and watched the steam rise until it disappeared. Chapter 4. The Calm. The weather settled into stillness. Days passed without wind, the sea smooth and glass-colored. Even the gulls were quiet. It was the kind of calm that made men uneasy, the pause between what had been and what was coming next. Tom worked on the roof again, then along the fence line. The wood was soft in places, moss creeping through the grain. He liked the sound of the hammer, clean and sure. At night, he sat by the fire and wrote until his eyes burned. He filled 3 more pages about storms, then crossed half of it out. He wrote about silence, then stopped halfway through the sentence. Sometimes he only drew lines instead of words, like waves that never touched the shore. On Sunday, he drove into town. The air smelled of baked bread and low tide. The streets were busy for the first time in weeks. Boats being hauled, nets laid out to dry. He walked to the dock and watched a group of kids fishing off the edge. Their laughter carried across the water, thin and bright. Charlie Brenner called from the fuel shack. "You alive, Tom?" "Barely." Charlie grinned. "That woman of yours blow through again?" Tom shook his head. "Not lately." Charlie nodded as if that were weather, too. "You going out today?" "Maybe tomorrow. Need to see what the traps look like. After a storm like that, half of them will be gone." Tom smiled. "Then I'll find the other half." Charlie looked at him for a long moment. "You never did like losing." "No one does. Some folks are better at it." Tom didn't answer. He walked to the end of the pier, the boards warm under the sun, and watched the horizon, empty, clean, endless. That evening, he found the letter. It was wedged between the screen door and the frame, folded once, damp at the edges. No envelope, just his name in her writing. He stood on the porch a while before he opened it. "Tom, I thought about staying, but you know how that ends. I'm heading south again. I need open road and distance. I don't expect you to wait, but I know you will. If you ever write something true, send it to me. L." He read it twice. The paper smelled faintly of her perfume. And rain. He didn't crumple it. He didn't fold it again. He left it on the table beside the candle stub and walked outside. The night was windless. The stars hung low and close, the air clear enough to see the far line of the sea. He sat on the porch steps, arms resting on his knees, and listened to the quiet. It wasn't peace. It was a kind of waiting with no end. He thought of her driving south, the narrow road winding through pine woods, headlights moving through fog. He pictured her singing with the radio, window half down, hair loose. She had always loved to leave. It was how she felt alive. He stayed where he was until the cold found him. When he went inside, the house felt smaller. The fire had gone out. He didn't light another. The next morning, he went out on the water. The tide was rising, slow and steady. Mist hung low, hiding the horizon. He rowed out past the point, the oars cutting small circles in the gray. He checked each buoy, lifting the traps one by one. Most were empty. A few held crabs, small and slow-moving, their shells still wet from the deep. He worked until his hands ached. When he stopped, the sun had broken through the fog. The sea around him flashed silver. For a moment, the world looked brand new. He thought of how quiet her voice had sounded on the phone, and how she always laughed before she left. The sound of her stayed with him more than her face. He pulled the boat around and rowed home. At the dock, Ellie was waiting. She had a basket under her arm and a frown on her face. "You look thin," she said. "I've been working." That's what people say when they mean they haven't eaten. He smiled. "What's in the basket?" "Bread and apples." "You'll take it." He took it. "Thank you." She hesitated. "She left a note, didn't she?" "Yes." "You going after her?" He looked out at the water. The surface was smooth now, the reflection of the sky trembling with each small ripple. "No," he said. "If she wants to be found, she'll stop moving." Ellie nodded slowly. "And if she doesn't?" He didn't answer. Sometimes silence was the truest thing left. Days stretched thin after that. He fixed the boat, mended nets, cleaned the gutters. He read old letters, then burned most of them in the stove. He started another notebook and filled the first page with a single line. Calm is just another kind of storm. He slept little, woke early, and watched the dawn creep across the water. The mornings were cool now. Autumn had come quietly, slipping in without a sound. He thought about calling her once or twice, but didn't. He didn't want to hear the distance in her voice. In mid-October, a letter came back from her. It was postmarked from North Carolina. No words this time, just a pressed maple leaf inside the envelope, red and perfect. He held it in his hand a long time before setting it on the windowsill. The leaf curled slightly as it dried, edges crisping in the sun. It looked like fire that couldn't burn. He thought of her driving farther south, the landscape changing color, the ocean warmer, the air heavy with new salt. He knew she wouldn't stay there either. She never stayed anywhere long enough for the calm to reach her. That night, he dreamed of the storm again. The roar, the dark, the brief electric flash of her face when she turned at the door. He woke with the sound of wind in his ears, but outside the night was still. He got up, lit the stove, and made coffee. He poured 2 cups again. The second sat there cooling until the first light touched the rim. He went out to the porch. The world was silent but alive. The calm had a pulse, slow but certain. Somewhere offshore, he knew, the wind was already gathering again. Chapter 5: The Lighthouse. The morning started gray and uneasy. The kind of light that promised nothing. Eli woke before dawn, hearing the wind shift. The sea had changed overnight, heavier, unpredictable, as if something deep below had turned over in its sleep. He stepped outside and smelled rain, though the sky held it back. At the docks, men were gathered near the harbor office. Their voices carried in fragments, broken by gusts. A small boat, the Clara, hadn't returned the night before. One of the younger fishermen, Pete's boy, had gone out late trying to beat the weather and hadn't come back. Eli listened without a word. The others looked to him as they often did, the old reflex still there. He wasn't captain anymore, not for years, but his silence had always carried weight. He stared out toward the horizon, where the morning light was silver and flat, and nodded once. "We'll go look," he said. They began to ready the boats. Ropes slapped against hulls. Diesel engines coughed awake. The sound filled the air with a rough comfort, something solid in the face of fear. Eli moved through the work methodically, but his thoughts drifted. He hadn't seen Mara since 2 days before, when she'd come by the wharf to bring him a thermos of coffee and stand beside him for a while without speaking. There had been a stillness between them that neither could break. Now he thought of her again, not as a lover or ghost, but as someone who might be watching the sea at that very moment, feeling the same unease. He finished securing the gear, climbed aboard, and pushed off. By mid-morning, the boats spread out across the inlet. The radio crackled with short, clipped messages. Rain came in thin lines, not enough to soak, but enough to sting the face. Eli's boat cut through the chop steadily. His hands remembered every motion without thought. He had spent half his life out here. The rhythm of tide and wind, the patience of waiting for what the sea would give back. Hours passed. Nothing. The horizon blurred with the sky. The world reduced to water, gray and endless. He turned the wheel, scanning the distance. Then he saw it, a sliver of white against the rocks near the point. A flash, like a scrap of sail or hull. He throttled down, leaning forward. As he neared, the shape resolved. It was the Clara, half shattered on the reef below the lighthouse. No movement on deck. The tide pushed her against the stones again and again, each impact dull and final. He called it in over the radio, voice steady. The others would take time to reach him. The inlet narrowed there, treacherous even in calm weather. He guided his boat as close as he dared and killed the engine. The silence that followed was immense. Only the sound of surf and stone. He dropped anchor and stood a long while, watching the wreck, until a sound behind him made him turn. Mara stood on the rocks above the tide line, her coat pulled close, hair whipping in the wind. She must have come along the lighthouse path from town. Her figure was small against the wide gray world, but her presence was sharp, unmistakable. He climbed the rocks to meet her. They didn't speak at first. "You shouldn't be out here," he said finally. "I heard about the boy," she replied. Her voice was steady but low. "I couldn't stay in town waiting." He nodded. She was like that, always had been. Waiting never suited her. They both looked toward the wreck again. The boat shifted with the tide, broken, yet still resisting the pull. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them, but neither said it aloud. "Do you think he's—" she started, but stopped herself. Eli answered quietly, "We'll find out." The rain came harder. They took shelter near the lighthouse, under the lee of the old wall. The air smelled of salt and rust. Inside the lighthouse keeper's room, long since unused, dust lay thick on the windowsill. Eli set down the lantern he'd brought, its light faint but steady. Mara removed her gloves and rubbed her hands together. "He was just a boy," she said softly. "I used to see him at the market, always smiling." Eli didn't answer. He was thinking of other storms, other losses. "You still carry it," she said then. "That same weight, even after all these years." He looked at her. "And you don't?" Her eyes didn't waver. "I do. That's why I came back." The wind shook the glass in the frame. For a while they said nothing. The storm had passed, but this one had its own center. Quiet, personal, impossible to navigate. By late afternoon, other boats arrived. The boy's body was found caught in the cove below, face turned away, arms folded as if at rest. They brought him to shore with care, wrapped in an old tarp. The men didn't speak. The work was too solemn for words. Eli and Mara stood apart, watching. The sea was calm again, deceptive in its peace. When it was done, the others left, taking the boy back to town. Eli stayed behind to tie down the boats and check the wreck once more. Mara didn't move. Finally, he looked up at the lighthouse and said, "We can go inside for a bit. The night'll fall soon." The climb was slow. The steps were narrow, damp from the mist. At the top, the lantern room opened around them, glass on all sides, the sea stretching endlessly beyond. The great lamp no longer turned, but its shell still caught the last of the light. It felt suspended between worlds, sea and sky, memory and silence. Mara walked to the glass and pressed her hand against it. "It's beautiful," she said. Eli stood beside her. "It used to keep men alive," he said. "Now it's just a relic." "Maybe that's what we are," she said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe." They stood close, the air heavy with unsaid things. "When you left," he said after a while, "I thought you'd never come back. I told myself it didn't matter. But it did." Mara's eyes stayed on the horizon. "It mattered to me too. I just didn't know what to do with it." The wind shifted, rattling the old panes. The world outside dimmed to a deep blue. "I thought about writing you," she said, "but I didn't trust the words. They never said what I meant." Eli turned toward her. "You could have just come." "I was afraid." "Of me? Of what I'd still feel?" The silence that followed was complete. Below them, the tide moved with slow certainty. The wrecked boat would soon vanish beneath it. Eli reached out, almost without thought, and brushed her hand with his. She didn't pull away. "You never remarried," she said. "No." "Why not?" He looked out at the horizon. "Because nothing else ever felt honest." Mara breathed in, the faintest tremor in her voice. "And now?" "I don't know," he said. "Do you?" She shook her head. "No. I just know the sea sounds the same. That's something." They stayed like that, watching the water darken, the light fade. When the first real darkness came, they descended together. Eli lit the way with the small lantern. Their shadows crossed and separated along the walls. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air was cool, damp with salt. Mara turned toward him, searching his face. "You'll go out again tomorrow?" "Yes," he said. "There's always something left to find." She nodded slowly. Then, after a pause, "Will you let me come?" He hesitated. "It's rough work." "I know." He studied her a long time, then said quietly, "All right." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't refusal either. It was the kind of answer that leaves space, for risk, for hope. She looked out toward the water, where the faint line of dawn would come again soon enough. "Eli," she said. He waited. "I didn't come back for the town," she said, "or for what we had. I came back because I wanted to remember who I was before everything broke." He nodded once. "Then you came to the right place." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. They walked together down the path toward the dim lights of town, their footsteps softened by the mist. Behind them, the lighthouse stood silent, the sea breathing steadily at its base. That night, the town was quiet. The storm had left its mark, fallen signs, scattered debris, but people slept again. Life, persistent as tide, went on. Eli lay awake, hearing the sea against the rocks. He thought of the boy, of loss, of Mara's hand in his. He thought of all the things he hadn't said and wondered if silence could ever be enough. Outside, the foghorn moaned once. Long and low. It sounded almost like a call. He turned toward the window, and for a moment, he imagined the light still turning in the tower, sweeping across the dark water, steady as memory. Chapter 6. The Firelight. By dusk, fog covered the harbor again. The air was thick enough to taste. Lights from the town blurred like lanterns underwater. Eli had spent the day tying down lines, mending a net that didn't need mending, waiting for the call that never came. The sea was too rough for a search at night, and everyone knew it. But he couldn't leave it alone. Mara found him at the wharf, crouched beside the winch. "You haven't eaten," she said. He didn't answer. His hands moved slowly, wrapping cord around the spindle, though there was no reason left to do it. "You can't go out there again now." Her tone wasn't pleading, only certain. He stood, looked at her. "I can't sit inside either." She took a step closer. "Then don't. Come up to the lighthouse. There's a stove there. You can stay warm for once." He hesitated. The idea of shelter felt too close to surrender. But she waited, her breath visible in the cold air. "All right," he said finally. They walked the path in silence. The fog wrapped around them like gauze. Only the faint hum of the sea reached through. Mara carried a small sack slung over her shoulder, bread, a bottle of whiskey, a few apples. The kind of things that make a night bearable. The lighthouse stood dark against the sky, the glass room above them a dim shadow. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of iron and old oil. She lit a lantern, then found the small iron stove and knelt to coax it alive. The flame caught, then grew, licking at the kindling. "Sit," she said. He sat. The sound of the fire softened the room. Mara poured whiskey into 2 tin cups. She handed him one and sat across from him, close enough that he could see the light moving in her hair. "To the sea," she said quietly. He raised his cup. "To what it keeps," he said. They drank. The whiskey was harsh, but it spread warmth through the chill. Time passed without measure. The fire snapped and hissed. Eli leaned back against the wall, watching the flame, feeling the ache in his shoulders ease. Mara spoke first. "When I left, I thought I was leaving to save us both." He didn't look at her. "It didn't feel like saving." "I know," she said. "I told myself I needed something else. But the truth was simpler. I couldn't stand seeing you so close to the sea every day. I was afraid of losing you the way others were lost." He nodded slowly. "You did anyway." She smiled without humor. "I did anyway." The fire popped. A piece of ember fell and rolled near her boot. She nudged it back with the toe. "You could have written," he said. "I tried. The words came out wrong. They always sounded smaller than what I meant." "They usually do." Mara looked at him, her face calm but tired. "And you? You never came after me." He met her gaze. "You were already gone." "That's not an answer." He drank the last of his whiskey and set the cup down. "Maybe I thought if I let you go, it would hurt less." "Did it?" He shook his head. "No." They sat a long while after that, the light from the stove flickering across the walls. Outside, the foghorn moaned. It sounded lonely, but steady. Eli reached into the sack and pulled out one of the apples. He sliced it with his pocket knife and handed half to her. She took it without a word. "Do you ever think about the years?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Mostly at night." "And I think about how we wasted them," he said. "How we tried to live separate lives and ended up circling the same piece of coast." Mara smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what people like us do. We circle things until they're safe to touch again." He looked at her across the narrow space. "And is it safe now?" Her eyes softened. "I don't know, but we're here." The stove's fire sank lower. Mara stood and added more wood. The flame brightened, throwing orange light up the walls. Her hands were steady. She moved like someone who knew how to take care of small things. Eli watched her quietly. When she turned, she saw his gaze and didn't look away. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I missed this," he said. "Not the talk, just the being." She smiled, but there was something sad in it. "You always said too little, Eli." "Words were never the problem," he said. "The timing was." She came closer then, standing in front of him. Her hands trembled once before she steadied them on his shoulders. "We can't fix what's gone," she said. "I know, but maybe we can stop breaking what's left." He nodded slowly. Then he lifted one hand and touched her face, the gesture light as a tide shift. For a moment, neither moved. Then she leaned into him, and the years between them folded away like a curtain drawn back. They kissed once, slow, uncertain, almost like remembering. It wasn't youth they found, but something quieter, recognition, forgiveness, the shape of what had survived. When they parted, the fire burned low again. Mara turned, stirred the coals with a piece of driftwood, then sat beside him. Their shoulders touched. Outside, the wind rose against the glass, a soft, restless sound. Eli spoke after a long silence. "Tomorrow I'll take the boat out again." She nodded. "I'll come with you." He looked at her. "You mean that?" "Yes. It'll be rough." "I don't mind. You hate the sea." "I hate losing to it," she said. He smiled faintly. "That's different." The night stretched thin. They lay down on the floor near the stove, using their coats for blankets. The warmth was uneven, the boards cold beneath them. But it felt right, simple, human. Mara's breathing slowed beside him. He could hear it in rhythm with the wind outside. "Eli," she said softly. "Yes. If we don't find peace out there, we'll find it here." He turned his head toward her. "You think so? I think peace is just another kind of tide. It comes when it wants." He smiled in the dark. "That sounds like something you'd say." Because it's true. They fell quiet again. The sound of the sea filled the space between them. Before dawn, he woke. The fire was out. The room was cold. He rose, stepped to the window, and looked down toward the harbor. The fog had lifted. The water lay still, waiting. He thought of the boy they'd lost, of the lives still bound to this shore, of Mara sleeping behind him. He realized that nothing was fixed, nothing was certain, yet something inside him had eased for the first time in years. He turned back. Mara stirred, opened her eyes. "What time is it?" "Early," he said. "Too early." She smiled faintly. "Then come back here." He did. They lay together until the first light touched the glass above them, thin and pale, like mercy. By mid-morning they would leave the lighthouse. By afternoon, the town would see them together again. Two people who'd once broken apart and now moved through the same world as if testing its edges. The sea would keep its silence. The tide would come and go. And somewhere between storm and calm, they'd find a way to stay afloat. Chapter 7. The Letters. The fog burned off by noon. The air was clear and sharp, the kind that makes the sea look endless and clean. Eli stood by the water, mending a torn line, though it hardly needed mending. His hands needed work, something to hold. The town moved around him in its small, familiar rhythm. Trucks on the wharf, gulls overhead, the smell of diesel and salt. Nothing had changed. And yet, something had. The night at the lighthouse lingered in him, not as regret, but as a quiet ache that refused to settle. Mara stayed at the inn for a while longer. She'd taken to walking early, along the cliffs or through the narrow back streets that led nowhere. People greeted her politely, their voices curious but kind. She smiled, said little. The town remembered her, but memory softens when time grows long. She spent her afternoons by the window in her small rented room, sketching the view of the harbor. It was an old habit, one she'd left behind when she'd left him. Now, her hand moved slower, as though it needed permission to remember what beauty was. Every few days, Eli stopped by. Sometimes he brought fish, sometimes nothing. They'd share coffee, exchange a few words, then drift into the same careful silence. One morning, she found an envelope on her windowsill. No name, no address. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, the handwriting unmistakable, his, though neater than she remembered. It read only, "The sea doesn't keep what it loves. It returns it, changed. E." She read it twice, then set it on the table. She didn't know if it was meant as a confession or a warning. That night she wrote back, though she didn't plan to send it. "The sea returns, everything changed." Maybe that's what we're afraid of. Not loss, but change itself. She folded it, left it on her desk. In the morning, she read it again and burned it in the ashtray. The days followed one another like the tide, steady, predictable, indifferent. Eli went back to sea when the weather allowed. Mara watched from the cliffs sometimes, her hair pulled back, the wind catching her coat. He saw her once through his binoculars and pretended not to. In town, people began to talk. Nothing cruel, only curious. Old friends asked Eli if she was staying. He shrugged. "Don't know," he said. They nodded, as if that answer explained everything. Mara helped at the dockside cafe when the owner fell ill. She poured coffee, wiped tables, served fishermen who looked at her without recognition. It felt almost like peace. But at night, when she returned to her room, the quiet became too large. She began to write letters again, not to Eli, but to the sea, to herself, to what she could not say aloud. "I came back thinking there would be something waiting. There wasn't. And maybe that's what forgiveness is, finding the courage to stand in an empty room." She folded them neatly, tied them with string, and kept them in a small box beneath the bed. One afternoon, she saw Eli repairing nets near the boatyard. She hesitated, then walked over. "You're quiet these days," she said. He glanced up. "Work's easier that way. Is that what you call it?" He smiled faintly. "It passes the time." She stood beside him, watching his hands. They were strong, lined, patient. "You still write things down?" she asked suddenly. "Sometimes." "What do you write?" "Mostly lists," he said. "Things I forget." She tilted her head. "Like what?" He looked at her. "Like what to say?" For a moment, the old warmth returned. Then a gust of wind came off the sea, and both turned toward it, blinking salt from their eyes. "Tomorrow looks fair," he said. "You could come out again if you want." "I might," she said. "You might or you will. I'll see how it feels." He nodded, went back to his nets. She lingered a moment, then walked away. That night, the wind rose. Not a storm, just enough to stir the water. Mara sat at her desk, the lamp's glow soft against the walls. She opened the box of letters and untied the string. She read through them slowly, one by one. Some were little more than fragments. some almost stories. When she reached the last one, she stopped. It was blank. She held it for a while, then began to write. We can't go back to what we were, but maybe we can learn how to stand beside what remains. She folded the paper, put it in an envelope, and wrote Eli on the front. In the morning, she placed it under a small stone by his boat. He would find it or not, it didn't matter. The act was enough. He found it by chance that afternoon, after returning from a short trip beyond the inlet. He recognized her handwriting and read it leaning against the railing, the sea moving beneath him. He didn't go to her. He didn't write back. But that night, he took out a small notebook from the drawer by his bed and wrote. Some things are said in silence. Some stay with you because they were never spoken at all. He closed the book, left it open on the table, and went to sleep with the sound of the wind in the eaves. Days became weeks. The town fell into its late-season quiet, tourists gone, only locals remaining. Mara kept helping at the cafe. Eli kept fishing the short routes. Their paths crossed, but rarely now. Once, they shared a bench outside the post office while waiting for the morning truck. She asked how the sea was. He said, same as ever. Then they both laughed, quietly, because it was a lie. There was a tenderness between them, but it was softer now, almost invisible, the tenderness of people who had reached the end of something and learned to live beyond it. In late October, Mara began packing her things. The landlady asked if she was moving south for winter. Maybe, Mara said. I haven't decided. She walked one last time along the pier, her coat pulled tight, the air heavy with the scent of kelp and cold. Eli's boat was moored near the end. She stopped, thinking he might appear, but he didn't. She left a small wrapped parcel on the deck, the box of letters, tied again with string. The next morning, he found it. Inside, the letters were stacked neatly, the top one unfolded. You once said the sea doesn't keep what it loves. Maybe it only returns what's learned to let go. He read it 3 times. Then he set the box down and sat beside it. The harbor was still. A single gull wheeled overhead. He felt no sadness, only a deep, steady quiet. He took out his notebook, wrote one line beneath the last entry. She was right. He closed it and looked toward the horizon. The water shone pale, like glass. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the headland, he lit a small fire near the dock. He fed the letters to it one by one. The paper curled and vanished into the air, carrying with it all that had been unsaid. When the last ember faded, he stood and watched the smoke drift out to sea. The tide was coming in. It touched his boots, cool and sure. He thought of her somewhere inland, packing or pausing, maybe looking back. He didn't wave. He didn't need to. Chapter 8. The Distance. The first frost came early that year. By morning, the fields above the harbor were silvered, the grass stiff beneath each step. Eli rose before dawn, as he always did, though he no longer needed to. The sea was quiet now, the season closing. He brewed coffee, sat by the window, and watched the horizon fade from black to pale gray. He thought of her sometimes when the light was like that, thin and clean, the way it had been the morning she arrived. He didn't resist the thought, but he didn't invite it either. It came as naturally as the tide. The boat rocked against its moorings. He'd meant to haul it out weeks ago, but hadn't found the heart for it. He told himself he'd do it before the next storm. That was enough for now. Mara had left town quietly. No one saw her go, though her room stood empty and the cafe owner found her apron folded on the counter. The landlady said she'd taken the early bus south. Some said Portland, others thought Boston. It didn't matter. She'd always been half on her way somewhere. Eli didn't ask. He only noticed the small absences, the sound of her footsteps on the boardwalk, the way she'd pause before speaking, as though testing whether the moment could bear another word. He told himself it was better this way. People like them didn't need goodbyes, they needed air. Still, when he walked home at dusk, he'd sometimes look at the road leading inland and imagine her just beyond the bend, walking with her coat drawn tight, her breath showing in the cold. Winter settled in slow and steady. The sea darkened, the gulls thinned, and the town grew small again. At the dock, Eli worked with what remained, patching gear, helping younger crews with repairs, teaching them things he'd once learned the hard way. He liked the company, the noise, the smell of rope and tar. It reminded him that life was still being made around him. But the evenings were long. He'd take his coffee to the shore, watch the light blink from the far buoy, and listen to the radio in the shed. Some nights he'd reach for his notebook, though the pages came slower now. Distance, he wrote once, isn't measured in miles. It's what stays between two people when they stop pretending not to care. He closed the book after that and didn't write again for days. Far south, in a small town near the marshes, Mara rented a room above a bakery. The air there smelled of yeast and river silt. She liked the anonymity. No one asked where she came from, and no one expected her to stay. She painted again, not the harbor this time, but fragments of it. The line of a boat hull, the gray curve of the shore, the shape of a man's shadow on the pier. When people asked what she painted, she said, weather. Her days were simple: bread in the morning, a walk by the river, a few hours at the easel. But the quiet was deceptive. Every so often, when she rinsed her brushes, she'd think of a line from one of the old letters. The sea doesn't keep what it loves. It came to her like a memory she couldn't quite forgive. In late December, a letter reached her. It wasn't from him. It was from the cafe owner, written in a shaky hand. Inside was a clipping from the local paper, a short note about a storm that had come in sudden and hard, damaging several boats near the outer harbor. No one was hurt. Still, seeing his name among the list of owners made her pause. She read it twice, folded the clipping, and set it aside. That night, she couldn't sleep. In the morning, she walked to the post office and bought a card, plain, with a small blue line across it. She stared at it a long while before writing. I heard about the storm. I hope you're well. M. She didn't add a return address. Eli found the card 3 days later, tucked among bills and winter catalogs. He stood by the counter in the general store, reading it once, then again. It was such a small thing, barely more than a whisper. Still, he felt something shift, like a rope loosening in his chest. He didn't answer right away. He carried the card with him for a week, folded in his jacket pocket. Then one night, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote back. The storm passed. The sea's fine. I am too. Thank you. He signed only his name and mailed it the next morning. He didn't expect a reply. For a while, that was enough. Winter deepened, then began to break. The harbor thawed, the air softened, the gulls returned. Eli spent his mornings on the boat again, not because he had to, but because it felt right to. He liked the feel of the oars, the rhythm of work. The world seemed steady in motion. One evening, as he rowed back toward shore, he saw a woman walking along the rocks near the jetty. The light was low, the wind rising. For a moment, he thought it was her, the way she moved, the shape of her coat. He raised a hand, half in greeting, half in doubt. The woman didn't turn. He smiled to himself, ashamed of his own hope. Spring brought visitors again. New faces, new talk. The town came alive in its small, patient way. Eli found comfort in it. Not joy, exactly, but a quiet sort of belonging. He knew every sound. The gulls, the rope against wood, the hum of a distant engine. The sea still gave what it gave, took what it took. He hadn't heard from her again. The card sat in the drawer, the edges worn from being read. He told himself it was better not to know where she'd gone. Love, once survived, becomes a kind of geography, not a place, but a map of what we've learned to live without. Far away, Mara finished her last painting of the winter. It was of the sea, not his sea, but a suggestion of it. The color muted, the horizon blurred. She titled it Distance. When the gallery owner asked what it meant, she said, "It's about learning how far light can travel before it disappears." She didn't mean to sound poetic. It was just the truth. That evening, she wrote another letter, the first in months. The distance changes nothing, but it teaches you what mattered. I still see the harbor sometimes in my sleep. Maybe that's enough. She didn't send it. She never sent any of them anymore. But writing it made her feel lighter, as if she'd said something that needed saying. By early summer, Eli finally hauled the boat from the water. The wood was worn, but sound. He cleaned it, oiled it, ran his hands along its sides. He thought of the years he'd spent chasing fish, storms, and ghosts. He'd once believed the sea could forgive him, that if he stayed close enough, it might bring something back. Now he understood. The sea forgave no one. It only endured. That night, as he walked home, the first fireflies of the season flickered in the grass. The air was warm, the sky turning purple above the dunes. He stopped near the cliff's edge and looked out. The lighthouse flashed once, then again, a steady, patient light. He thought of her then, not as she'd been when she left, but as she'd looked that morning years ago, standing on the pier, sunlight on her hair, the world wide open before her. He whispered something into the wind, though even he couldn't hear it. Weeks later, another letter arrived. No return address, only his name on the front in her hand. He opened it slowly. I saw your name in a small article about the harbor fair. You looked well. I thought I should tell you. The painting sold. It was called Distance. I'm glad we had what we did. I hope the sea is kind. There was nothing more. He folded the letter and placed it inside his notebook, between the old pages. Then he closed it for the last time. That evening, he went down to the dock. The air was still, the tide low. He sat on the edge, feet dangling above the water, and watched the moon rise over the inlet. He thought of her, somewhere inland, her hands stained with paint, the same moonlight touching her window. He imagined her smiling, not at him, but at the thought of all they'd managed to survive. He smiled too, and for the first time in years, he felt no distance at all. Chapter 9. The Book of Tides. The sea was calm the morning he found the notebook. Eli had been cleaning out the shed, coils of old rope, rusted tools, a cracked lantern, the small archaeology of a man's years by the water. The notebook had fallen behind a crate, its cover soft from damp. He sat on the step, the air smelling of pine and salt, and turned through the pages. Most were blank, but there were fragments of old notes, sketches of weather, tides, half-thoughts written between seasons. He had written once that the sea forgave no one. Looking at it now, he wasn't sure that was true. Sometimes, he thought, forgiveness was just the sea continuing to rise and fall, no matter what was lost to it. He set the book aside and watched the tide move in. The sound was the same as it had always been, eternal, indifferent, comforting. By late summer, the town had grown busy again. Children ran along the docks, tourists filled the cafe, and the sound of life returned with a soft insistence. Eli watched it all without bitterness. He had become part of the background, the man who fixed nets, who could be trusted with a line or a story. One evening, the cafe owner handed him an envelope. Forwarded from down south, she said. Figured it was yours. The paper was creased, the postmark faint. He turned it over before opening it. Inside was a single page, her handwriting steady and clear. I thought you might like to know. They're showing Distance at a small gallery in Portland. It's strange to see people stand before something you made and find their own stories in it. Maybe that's what all of this was, just stories finding their way back to sea. Be well, M. He read it twice, then folded it and slipped it into his jacket. That night, he walked along the beach until dark. The sand was cool, the water brushing his boots. Above him, the stars were faint but patient. He felt the pull of memory, not painful anymore, just deep. A week later, he made the drive to Portland. It had been years since he'd gone that far from the coast. The city felt strange, too fast, too loud, but when he found the gallery, he stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping in. The room was small, white walls, the air smelling faintly of oil paint and dust. Her painting hung near the back, a wide stretch of muted blues and gray, a horizon almost invisible in the haze. Distance. He stood before it, hands in his pockets, and let the quiet take him. At first, he saw nothing but color. Then, slowly, he began to see what she'd hidden there. The line of a small boat, barely visible, and in the lower right corner, the suggestion of two figures on the shore. It wasn't them, not exactly, but it might as well have been. He smiled, and for the first time in a long while, felt something like peace. He didn't stay long. When he left, the sky was overcast, the air thick with salt from the bay. He stopped once before driving home, at a small bookstore near the water. On impulse, he bought a blank notebook. Back in the harbor, the days began to shorten again. He worked less, walked more. Some evenings he'd sit by the rocks and write. Not about her, not directly, but about the sea, the town, the weather, the things that stayed. He filled the first pages with fragments, then whole thoughts. The tide never really leaves. It just changes its shape. Love doesn't end, it drifts. Like light across water. We mistake silence for loss. But silence is what carries us forward. He didn't know if anyone would read it. That didn't matter. Writing had become a way of listening, to the wind, to the world, to what remained unsaid. Far away, Mara was still painting. Her new studio overlooked a river, though she said she missed the smell of salt. She'd kept few things from the harbor, a shell, a small coil of rope, and a photograph someone had taken at the fair, with his boat in the background. When people asked about her work, she said it was about time. Not nostalgia, just the way things keep moving even when we stop. One afternoon, a man approached her after a show. He said he'd seen Distance months ago and hadn't stopped thinking about it since. She thanked him and smiled. When he asked if she would ever paint the sea again, she said, "Always." That night, she started a new canvas, pale gray, a horizon line barely there. At the bottom she wrote in faint pencil, "For what remains." In the harbor, autumn returned. The boats came in early, the wind sharpened. Eli walked each morning along the tide line, his steps slow, steady. He'd begun reading again. Old books, mostly, some Hemingway, some Steinbeck, and found a strange comfort in their restraint. The words didn't explain anything. They just existed, clean and clear. He'd once believed love needed to be spoken to be real. Now he understood that sometimes love was just the absence of bitterness. A steady kindness that stayed long after the fire burned out. One afternoon, he sat at the table with his new notebook open and began writing the last entry. The tide writes its own story. We spend our lives trying to read it, to understand the rise and fall, the pull and release. In the end, it's simple. Everything returns. Not as it was, but as it must be. He closed the book, left it on the table, and went outside. The light was low, the sky turning the color of pewter. The air smelled of rain. He walked down to the water, where the waves lapped gently at the rocks. He could hear the lighthouse in the distance, its slow, even pulse. He thought of her, as he always did when the light came like this, softly, from below the horizon. He didn't miss her anymore, not in the way he once had. It was something quieter now, almost reverent. The tide touched his boots. He smiled and whispered, "Good night." Months later, long after the winter storms had passed, a small package arrived at Mara's door. No note, only a book wrapped in brown paper, a notebook filled with handwriting she knew at once. She sat by the window, the light falling over the pages, and read. There were lines about the sea, about loss, about the way silence becomes language. In the final entry, he had written, "For M, we are the tide. What leaves returns, changed, but still part of the same sea." She closed the book and held it for a while. Then she set it on the table beside her paints. Outside, the river moved slow and steady, carrying the light downstream. She stood, walked to the easel, and began another painting. At the bottom of the canvas, beneath the first layer of blue, she wrote in faint, invisible strokes, "The Book of Tides." Epilogue. Years later, visitors to a small coastal museum would find the painting hanging in a quiet corner. No plaque told their story. Only the title remained, "The Book of Tides." If you stood close enough, you could just make out two faint shapes at the water's edge. The light between them was thin, almost gone, but still there. And beyond them, the sea, endless, forgiving, alive.